What happened at the end of the war is that you had large numbers of Iraqis fleeing Kuwait City in a huge convoy on a highway running north out of the city. They were attacked from the air, and I think for about 7 miles there were just destroyed vehicles. We then nicknamed it the Highway of Death. I drove up that road shortly after the attack, in which, you know, there were charred bodies, you know, half out the windows of the cabins of the trucks, and you could see where cars had veered off into the desert to try and escape the explosions. It was a horrible carnage that shook up the Bush administration because the images were so horrific. But those images were not, by and large, broadcast.
That was Pentagon blackout. They wanted only the pictures they wanted when they wanted them, and they wanted to control everything. And that was a form of military censorship.
They flag waved in a way that I think ultimately damages our democracy. Everything was shown in red, white, and blue with heroic music. They made going to war seem something wonderful, something like a harmless video game.
Stand by, we're looking.
With the more or less conscious complicity of the American media, the Pentagon successfully transformed a terrible war into a harmless video game. A war that resulted in 250 people killed on the side of the coalition forces, and between 200,000 and 500,000 people killed on the Iraqi side. We will probably never know the exact count.
Attack aircraft, this is Holland. That was on target, on target.
I think it was so sad. So sad. I mean, I know that after Vietnam, they made a command decision on this body count business, which was so horrifying. They said no more body counts and so forth. That is total control of the news. From 9/11 on, the American press suddenly had to be the super-patriots, or patriots anyway, and they were afraid of being called un-American, unpatriotic.
A lot of television companies felt pressure from their management and from people who work in them. Not so much the networks themselves, but some of the others and some of the smaller groups, to be more patriotic.
The press went into a coma.
And any kind of questioning of the enterprise against Afghanistan, against Iraq, became a kind of defiling of the memory of those who had been killed. Yes, we did suffer a horrible tragedy and a crime against humanity, but it was manipulated and used, as these things often are, by the war makers to carry out a war that should have never been fought.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
This president just laid down the law. You're with us or against us, or for his team. You're on board or you're not. So I think they all get that message very quickly.
What's incredible is that today, when you reread some of the tons and tons of articles, or when you review those images, you will find words that you would never have thought would have been used in 2004 in a supposedly sophisticated and refined language. Good and evil. Well, this is theology. I mean, this brings us back to the Middle Ages.
It was just pathetic. It was the worst it's been since before Vietnam. The American press swallowed and regurgitated and amplified just about every lie the Bush administration put forward.
The fear card was very important. I mean, everybody felt the tension of 9/11, 9/11, 9/11, and then going into a war. You don't want to rock any boats. It's my country. May she always be right, but my country right or wrong.
Helen.
President, on that note, we understand you have advisors who are urging you to go after Iraq, take out Iraq, Syria, and so forth. Do you really think that the American people will tolerate you widening the war beyond Afghanistan? And I have a follow-up.
Thank you for warning me. As I mentioned, Helen, this is a long war against terrorist activity. And the doctrine I spelled out to the American people in front of Congress said not only will we seek out and bring to justice individual terrorists who cause harm to people, to murder people, we will also bring to justice the host governments that sponsor them, that house them and feed them. You mentioned Iraq. There's no question that the leader of Iraq is an evil man.
All of a sudden, out of the blue, after, these many years from Gulf War I, Saddam Hussein is on the radar screen. Why? I mean, what had he done in the intervening times? And suddenly we knew they had an agenda.
I think we went to war because George Bush's political advisors told him this was an easy way to get reelected.
We went to war in Iraq because a group of very limited neoconservative people who know nothing about the Middle East and how the world works thought that we would have a cakewalk into a big pond of oil and be able to run it.
And so they had to look like they appear to be doing something substantial about fighting terrorism. And Iraq was an easy target, which also meshed with their interest in the oil, their interest in getting rid of Saddam.
They had built it up. It was subliminal by this time. Every time they came out on the White House podium, either the president or the press secretary said Saddam Hussein, Al-Qaeda, Saddam Hussein, terrorism, Saddam Hussein, 9/11, Saddam Hussein, in the same breath.
It's an established tradition in the Bush family. Already, back in 1990, flat-out lies were used to establish the casus belli for the first Gulf War. A young Kuwaiti girl named Nawira testified in front of the American Congress. She described how she had seen Iraqi soldiers slaughter babies by unplugging their incubators.
I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators, took the incubators and left the children to die on the cold floor.
And she cried, famously, on national television while she told this horrible story. She posed or presented herself as a refugee from Kuwait who had to keep her identity anonymous for fear of reprisals against her family back in Kuwait. Now I learned later that, and reported later in the New York Times, ironically, that Naira was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States. And it's very unlikely she was in Kuwait at the time she said she was, and certainly not a disinterested witness. And subsequently, more reporting was done. It turned out that the Iraqis pulled no babies from incubators. There's not a single documented case of a baby being pulled from an incubator and dying during the Iraqi occupation of Kuwait. It just didn't happen. It's a fabrication. But it had a tremendous influence on public opinion here, and it clearly influenced the votes of several senators who voted for the war who might have voted against.
Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror.
Bush Jr. had been taught a lesson by Bush Sr. In 2002, the American public opinion was fully convinced of the extremely improbable collusion between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda.
I think it's easy to confuse those two things. Wait, they're both over there. They both speak Arabic, I think. They both sort of look funny. They're both dangerous. They must be friends.
They didn't know anything about Arab culture, about Sunnis and Shiites. They don't know the difference. They don't know the difference between... They don't even know that... Most Americans don't know that Iranians are not Arabs. They think they're all the same people. And so it's an ignorant country on this level.
And what happened since September 11th is the Bush administration was very good at exploiting the collective ignorance of the American people. 280 million people who live in the most technologically advanced society the world has ever seen, and yet we are collectively the most ignorant people in the world about the world we live in. And from that ignorance comes fear. And the Bush administration has exploited that ignorance to generate fear.
When the inspectors first went into Iraq and were finally denied access, a report came out of the IAEA that they were 6 months away from developing a weapon.
I ask you to check the record. you will find that the weapons inspectors were ordered out of Iraq by the United States government.
And curiously, not a single newspaper reported on the fact that there was no such International Atomic Energy Agency report until about 3 weeks later, when the Washington Times, a very right-wing pro-war newspaper, ran a very thorough story. They buried it, unfortunately, about the non-existence of this report.